Hello, all you wonderful people out there in the dark. Thank you again for checking in. Today, I wanted to share with you a home here in Lake Elsinore, known as Amiee's Castle. But before we hop in the car and take a brief look at this house, I wanted to share with you a brief history of, quite frankly, a fascinating lady known as Amiee Temple McPherson. She was born in 1890 and she passed away in 1944. She's best known as Sister Amiee, born in Canada, but she's a Pentecostal evangelist. And her fame and notoriety took off in the early 1920s through, quite frankly, the mid-30s, I suppose. What's so fascinating is she really was a pioneer of the modern media religious service where you start to use entertainment as part of your sermon, if you will. And her use of the radio at that time just revolutionized everything we do today, quite frankly. Her Angelus Temple, she built that or had that built in Echo Park. And I think in the first 7 years, something like 40 million visitors went to this temple. And obviously, Pentecostal evangelist, big time faith healing, speaking in tongues. But she met her first husband, I'm not sure exactly when, but Robert Semple. He was a Pentecostal missionary from Ireland. Met her and she joined his missions, which is where I think she got the Pentecostal bug, I guess, if you will. And they went to China. Unfortunately, her husband, he ended up dying of dysentery in Hong Kong. She later married her second husband, Harold McPherson. She gets the third name. He was an accountant, and basically, he loved her a lot because they ended up selling everything and coming out to the West Coast, and lived in, I guess what you'd call a gospel car, kind of doing tent revivals, things of that nature. And I think for old Harry, it got to be a bit too much. He's the kind of cat that likes some stability. He ends up leaving Amiee and going back home, and they divorced in like 1918. Harold chose poorly because she only continued to rise in fame and money, because that Angelus Temple, I think, cost nearly $250,000 to build in $1919, $1920. It's a tremendous sum of money. But she met her third husband, David Hutton, and he ended up pissing her off because when she was traveling the world preaching, he was back here promoting himself as Amiee's man and doing a lot of entertainment and hobnobbing with Hollywood. And I think that frustrated her, and she cut his ass loose in like 1933. But anyway, she builds this Angelus Temple in Echo Park. It continues to grow. Her radio program grows. She has a weekly magazine called the Foursquare Crusader. And by the way, the Foursquare Church, it still exists today, but at that time it was the four squares represent salvation, baptism, divine healing, and return of the big man, of course, himself, Jesus. But some interesting things about her. In 1922, she was the very first woman to preach a sermon wirelessly. She was the second woman in the country to be given a broadcast license, which is amazing. She even got Robert Schuller Sr. Frustrated enough with her that he wrote several papers and called it McPhersonism, and how she was somewhat out of touch with the Christian faith, because I think at that time, being, a widow and divorced twice, she dressed, I suppose, what they would consider provocatively. And I don't think she was a literalist when it came to the Bible and creationism to some degree, though she was involved in the Scopes trial and sided with William Jennings Bryan, was against Darwinism. But I think on the whole, she wasn't quite a literalist. And, you got to imagine, she was more popular than Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford. She was basically the cream of Hollywood at that time. But as you gain in popularity, you find, I think, that it's not as exciting as you hope it would be. And she ends up building a home here in Lake Elsinore. A realty firm actually gives her some property on the lone hill that exists here. And I think she built a home hoping to escape. Unfortunately, I think that was short-lived, as it didn't take too long for people to find her, even though Echo Park and Elsinore is probably, 65 to 75 miles apart. In 1929, that's a major distance to cover. But in 1926, supposedly she was kidnapped and presumed dead, or let me back up. She was thought to be dead, and then she turned up a few weeks later, 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, claimed that she was kidnapped by some Mexicans. They put a cloth that had drugs laced in it, and she passed out, woke up in some house in Mexico, climbed out a window, wandered around for a couple of days until someone found her. Most people believe she was having an affair with a former employee of the Angelus Temple, a cat named Ken Ormiston, and they were screwing around in Los Angeles, and then they went down to Mexico someplace and were together for a while, and they basically, she just dropped her off on some street. She wandered around for a while and kind of concocted the story to cover up the affair. Ultimately, the case was dismissed. I think when you have that kind of bread, you're able to convince people not to talk about it, and people recant their stories. But the press, I think, at that point, had started to turn against her. And ultimately, in 1944, she died of a drug overdose. She OD'd on fentanyl, which is a sedative. Presumably, some people said it was suicide, but presumably she was just taking pills and over-medicated herself. She has been portrayed in several books. Sinclair Lewis, his Elmer Gantry novel. I think it's Sharon Faulkner is the character. Nathaniel West, Day of the Locust. I think Geraldine Page plays her in that movie. But the caricatures of her have existed in movies and television. Most recently, I think Showtime's Penny Dreadful, the City of Angels. Some of those characters in that series certainly represent Amiee. She did a tremendous amount of good, make no mistake. I think on some level she was a wackadoodle, but she did a lot of good for the homeless and the disadvantaged. The short time she was very, very popular. But it's worth crack a book, do a Google search, read about her. I think she's a very interesting and I suppose in the end sad character. But take a look here. Here's a couple of pictures of Amiee, and then also some pictures of the Angelus Temple, which is still in Echo Park today. There you go. So now let's jump in the car and I will show you this home, which is in private hands. I think it was purchased a few years ago by the Foursquare Church, and they did the best they could to restore it. It's in private hands currently. I don't know what the current owners, I don't know if they live there or what their plans are. But we'll try to drive by and get you a sense of what this place looked like. So we've arrived at Amiee's castle, and before we get out and try to take a few shots, I don't want to spend too much time here. There's caretakers that look out or look after the property. I think they get a lot of visitors that come to maybe cause trouble, which is something we certainly do not want to do. But anyway, construction on this began in 1929. The architect was Edwin Bickman. The house itself is about 4,400 square feet. It's a 5-bedroom, 6-bath. It cost about $286,000 to build at that time, which is a tremendous sum of money. In today's dollars, it's probably about $4.3 million. But you have to remember, 1929, Elsinore was literally the middle of nowhere, probably 75 miles from Echo Park, where Amiee had her church, and a lot of her congregation and stuff lived in that area. Amiee had just returned from the Holy Land, so you'll see a lot of Islamic and Moorish influence. The architect, Edward Bickman, I think this is his claim to fame because I couldn't find a lot of information about him. So I think this is maybe his one and only work that people still remember. The Cleveland Realty Corp actually donated this to Amiee to build her castle, and I think their plan was, at that time she was obviously one of the most famous people in Hollywood because it was all about radio in 1929, that more of Hollywood would come out this way and it would become the playground of the rich. But I think the Depression ruined that for them. But this area, this hill, was called Country Club Heights district of Elsinore. But she built her castle. She actually lived here from 1929 to 1939. As I understand it, she sold it and used that money to help her congregation feed the people of Los Angeles and keep the lights on in a lot of places. I think Edwin's influence, you'll see a little bit of Irving Gill, who was an architect that lived from, 1870 to 1936, and he falls into that Frank Lloyd Wright sort of category. We're coming out of the Victorian era, and we're getting into a very minimal sort of architecture, and we're starting to use reinforced concrete, steel, and glass much more. So I think there's some influence on this house. But so let's get out and try to get a couple pictures for you. So here's the garage to Amiee's castle, and as I understand it, you would park there and you would slowly ascend several staircases on up to the home itself. Another shot of the home. Sun's coming up, so hopefully there's not too much glare. There is Amiee's castle. You can see what a wonderful view she had of Lake Elsinore. My goodness. We don't want to disturb the new residents, but another angle here of Amiee's castle. Amie's castle from a distance. So here's some of the views that Amiee would have had in her days. Kind of the top of the hill here in Lake Elsinore. Obviously all these homes did not exist at that time. But there is the entrance. So there you have it, Amie's castle. I hope you enjoyed a brief look at her home. She's a fascinating and tragic person in our history, and I think she's worth a moment of your time. So please Google her, crack a book. I briefly touched on her life in the smallest possible way, and I think she deserves a little bit more research if you're interested. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Please like, tell your friends, don't be afraid to comment. And as always, in this world, when you could be anything you want, please be kind, be humble, be forgiving, and be melting snow. Bye-bye.